so much of what's happening in the developing world is driven by new build densification.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of buildings are torn down because the value of land goes up, or the allowable density goes up. So there is a whole economic logic to how things are being torn down and built. I mean, how do we thinking as a designer, how do I begin to anticipate or future-proof against these forces? What are the things I need to think about at the beginning of the design process that kind of preempts some of these shifts in land value and how building stocks are assessed?
When I've worked on some major master plans, so I worked on a master plan with Rem Koolhaas in London, White City, and that's 20 years ago now, but this is the kind of timeline for master plans as well. At the beginning, one of the things we identified was the scarcity of land and the need for density and of course density in our cities, and also creating a mix. So it goes on to thinking about the implications of transport, the 15-minute walking city, and how we create density and a mix of uses and so on. So we're creating neighbourhoods into which our buildings sit rather than individual pieces that stand alone. So I think that's an important, connection to transport, location, making sure we've got the right mix. So it's a slightly broader issue in terms of planning and for the future. But what I would say in terms of tall buildings, there's very few have actually been demolished. I think there's only about 10 buildings over 200 metres tall that have been demolished. Really? And I would like us to start to see tall buildings as kind of fixed infrastructure in a city. If you put up a tall building, it's a fixed point, and you might reclad it or upgrade it and so on. So that would bring us on to thinking about projects from a alterability or flexibility and alterability in the future. I think I just made alterability up as a word, but anyway. But I would cite as a good example Leadenhall in London, the cheese grater, nicknamed the cheese grater with Richard Rogers. That was again with Lang O'Rourke, who I mentioned earlier, a very innovative contractor, and we designed and built that with 80% off-site construction. And that's a 220 metre tall tower. And the architecture, of course, of Richard Rogers is very much about components that come together. So we were able to build up bigger components. So for the cores, for example, we built components about the size of a bus and put those into place in one lift. So the implication being there that if you design something that can be assembled like that, you could also reverse the process, and you could have therefore design for disassembly. And if you can have design for disassembly, then you can start to separate the pieces and recover the materials. Now you might not for that building take it completely apart, but you might take parts of it apart, and then you might interchange and upgrade it over time. So the sooner we start to design buildings that can be changed and adapted over time through the way we approach putting components and pieces together and so on, then the sooner we'll be able to start to upgrade our what I would call with tall buildings almost infrastructure over time, the fixed parts of our city.
There is a lot of conversation around the question of disassembly. And how we design in a modular way that then extends the life of the components, that, the component lives on beyond the demise of the building, so to speak. There is also conversation about adaptability, which is to say that, buildings get torn down because they are obsolete. And therefore, if we can design buildings to have easy change of use, for example, then that again, goes to the extension of the life of the building. My big struggle is with density, and in my teaching, for instance, I often ask students to design buildings that can be densified. So you have a mid-rise building that can become a tall building, in time, because you need more gross floor area and so on. And I think what that leads you to is a position on capacity buffer. So the building is over-designed, to begin with. The structure or the foundation is more than it needs to be for what it is in the medium term, because you just don't know what the long term is going to be. I mean, is there a train of thought along those lines that you've heard of where buildings become future-proof because they anticipate densification, not just change of use?
There's a very good example that we've done. It wasn't necessarily the intention, but it points the way. There's a project in London, number 1 Triton Square, which we designed 25 years ago. And therefore, we've got all of the drawings and all of the information and so on, which is a key part of this, which we don't necessarily have for all of the built environment. So we had all the drawings, and we were asked by the client to increase the floor plate area by double. And to do that, and it had, as you mentioned earlier, it had quite a big atrium space, so we took advantage of that. It didn't have the foundation capacity, so we had to upgrade the foundations. But you can do that, and some of that you can be building into the design at the early stages. It's a balance between obviously the embodied carbon and the impact of building in something extra at the beginning, as opposed to what you might therefore facilitate later on. But in that case, we were able to increase the building by double in terms of floor space, using lightweight construction and a little bit of strengthening. And the facades, we took facades off, we took them to a local pop-up factory, and we refurbished them and reclad the building with the same facade. So if we could design to make that easy in the future, as you just suggested, I think that would also be a big step forward. And there's an example of where we've done that. Yeah,
I have one more question about the idea of design intelligence, which you alluded to, which is how do we design rather than just take a kind of a blanket view that this is good or that is evil, really to think about things in a more sophisticated way. And I'm reminded of a project in Sydney, Australia, the Atlassian. I don't know if you are aware of it. It's a very interesting project because it hybridizes timber and concrete. So the core and the slabs, every 6 or 8 floors is made out of concrete, but then the infill between that is made out of timber, and then it's got this steel exoskeleton. So the goal here is to reduce the embodied energy, embodied carbon of the project by reducing the net amount of concrete and steel. But it creates a whole new typology. It creates a whole new way of looking at high-rise buildings that I hadn't seen before. I found that really exciting. I wonder if you have other examples of buildings that are pushing design intelligence, not just an either-or question, but really how to hybridize better.
Yeah, I mean, as the example I gave you earlier, H7 or H7 in Munster, which was at the beginning of that timber concrete composite wave, just trying to bring new products to market. And that idea of mixing timber and concrete is still being explored, and I'm seeing it a lot in projects in different locations. If you've got a fixed concrete core and floor plate for a building, and then in between you can create variety and change and flexibility.
Right.
And looking at ideas to be able to, on a recent high-rise project, we looked at the idea of removing parts of the floor plate in the building, because quite often it's the connection between floors that creates an issue. So being able to do that easily in a high-rise building to create kind of vertical neighbourhoods, I think is could bring a longer life to these buildings, more flexible uses. So it's partly about the materials, but it's also partly about the way buildings are used, the way high-rise buildings are being used. And the other thing you'll see is a lot of people trying to bring more humane and natural environments into high-rise buildings. So a lot of effort to bring nature and green into buildings. Of course, Bosco Verticale in Milan was an extreme example of that, literally a vertical forest. But we see that in a lot of projects
Thank you for expanding the conversation to not just materiality, but the quality of the built environment. I think that's a really important thing to not forget, that at the end of the day, these projects are really meant for humans and our relationship to natural systems.